This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me, you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Play Toast. Today is October 3rd, 2019, and this is episode 158. Play Toast is the BC Politics podcast. Tell us what you think of the show by leaving us a review or get at us on social media. Thank you to our patrons for your support. Your generosity makes this show possible. Help us build the show by throwing us a couple bucks a month at patreon.com/playtoast and by recommending the podcast to a friend. It's the election, and if you're listening, no doubt you're probably the type of person your friends go to ask what's going on, so recommend the podcast. Editing services are provided by Cortado Productions. I'm Scott Blunderboom.
And I'm Shannon Waters.
Thank you for joining me tonight.
Yeah, always good to come on and kind of debrief. It's the end of my work week, so I'm done writing about BC Poly for the week, and now I get to talk about politics a bit before getting into my weekend.
Awesome. On today's show, we'll talk about what to expect when the legislature resumes, as well as the latest in the federal election. And a big anniversary just happened this week. It's been 3 years since Ian and I launched the podcast. This Monday was the 30th of September, which was when we dropped episode 1 way back in 2016.
Woohoo!
It's hard to believe it's been 3 years already.
I know, I've been doing BC Today for 2 whole years now, so not quite as long as you and Ian have been doing this. But yeah, congratulations on the 3-year anniversary.
Thank you. Well, since you mentioned BC Today, Pledgos, in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC Legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicoast enter the offer code CITIZEN, all lowercase, for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca.
And now would be a really great time to do that free trial because the BC Legislature is about to go back into session on Monday. So it will be a very different, well, not very different, but a different kind of reporting than what I've been doing this summer. A little more structured and a lot more legislative content.
Yeah, we'll look forward to it. The newsletter is a huge part of actually just us keeping the show up and running by always having something to reference, and all your hard work definitely is appreciated.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
Well, let's jump into it with segment 1, Back to the Ledge. So, as you hinted at, the legislature's coming back starting on Monday. But first, I kind of want to go over what's happened in BC politics since the legislature rose at the start of the summer.
That seems like a really long time ago. It's been quite a busy summer by sort of political standards. I mean, when the legislature isn't sitting, it's not like, everything BC Poly related grinds to a halt. It just means that, the MLAs aren't in the House every day and we're not passing legislation. There's no question period, that kind of thing. But there was a lot going on this summer. So yeah, let's get into that.
Okay, well, kind of the big thing that's happened recently is the forestry sector's been in a certain amount of trouble, and how the province has responded to it has been one of those stories that's happened over the summer that we didn't really touch on too much, but I think kind of came to the forefront in the last couple of weeks when a convoy of logging trucks showed up here in Vancouver, coincidentally the day before the climate march.
Also during the Yeah, and during the BC Union of BC Municipalities Convention, which was downtown at the Vancouver Conference Centre. Yeah,
so the forestry sector's been in a lot of trouble for a while. It's a combination of not a great trade environment, the stock of fiber is down quite a bit, and that's probably climate related. So there's been a lot of mill closures, layoffs. And how has the province responded to it?
So it kind of took them a while to get rolling. I will give the Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development Minister some credit here and say that I think there was probably stuff going on behind the scenes, talking to communities and affected companies and employees. But there really wasn't a lot of sort of public facing, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to help people going on through the summer. Like these mill closures had already started happening when we were in session in the spring. And the government, just sort of seemed to be like monitoring the situation. I talked to Minister Donaldson in July, and he talked about all of these things that the government was going to be doing, helping workers retrain, helping those who are, fairly close to retirement, sort of bridge their way out of the industry. The government earlier in the year had announced revitalization initiatives, one targeted at an interior forestry, which has sort of suffered the most damage over this past year, and one targeted at coastal forestry. And then a few weeks ago, we got this announcement of basically an aid package for forestry, $69 million that was going to be earmarked for specific programs to help communities who were impacted by mill curtailments and closures. Most of that money was actually for retirement bridging, which I thought was interesting and probably kind of speaks to the long-term prospects for forestry in BC. And in terms of the timing, we had just heard from the finance minister about sort of drawing down of the provincial contingencies and sort of some not quite belt tightening, but I believe Minister James used the phrase like economic storm clouds or sort of a global storm ahead. So bracing for some issues on the financial front. And then we hear about this aid package coming in, and as a reporter, it was kind of embarrassing because nobody directly asked the forest minister, where is this money coming from? I think there was an assumption on the part of a lot of people that, it was going to be drawn from contingencies, maybe from the funding that had been earmarked for wildfires, which we had a fairly tame summer this summer in terms of wildfires. And then it turns out that sort of quietly and behind the scenes, the forest minister had sent letters to various local government officials telling them that the rural dividend grant program for this year is being suspended, and that money is going to be diverted to this forestry aid package, which, as you can imagine, went over like a lead balloon.
Oh, there was a lot of backlash to that, for sure. And so this is a program, the Rural Dividend, that's been in place for, I believe, 3 years now, and basically provides funding to small communities under 25,000 to help them with a range of projects. And that's basically dried up for the next year, and they're basically not handing anything out until 2020, I believe, was what I saw.
At least. See, that's the thing that is still kind of unclear. Both the premier and the forest minister have said, look, it's not like we're just going to throw the applications for this year in the garbage. We're going to hold on to them. We will get back to them. The funding will be allocated later at a certain unspecified time. But the fact is that the maximum allotment for this year for the Rural Dividend Fund was going to be $25 million, which is less than half of the money that is going to forestry. Now, the premier kind of defended this decision at the UBCM. Obviously, he was sort of criticized very roundly, and the Liberals were making a lot of hay out of it. And he said, the reason that we use this money is because we didn't have to go to the Treasury Board because it's within the forest minister's purview to sort of direct that funding as he sees fit. So we just wanted to get it done quickly and help people quickly, which I don't think was really a lot of comfort to communities that have been affected by these mill closures and are seeing another funding stream that they relied on, often for things like economic development initiatives or increasing tourism, stuff like that. And also for those small communities who haven't been affected by mill closures and so aren't going to be getting any of the redirected funding, but aren't going to be getting anything from the Rural Dividend Program this coming year either. Yeah,
it seems to really hit a lot of communities hard. And it's, from the sounds of it, not insignificant amount of the budgets of a lot of these small communities. And just having that suddenly dry up without much warning has caused a lot of concern in all the small towns across the province.
I think the way that it was handled too just wasn't, it just wasn't a good look to not have been upfront about like, hey, we have a crisis. We're going to redirect some funding right now while we figure stuff out, kind of bear with us. I don't know that would have fixed the situation. Obviously, people are still going to be frustrated about having this funding stream dry up, but you at least wouldn't have had sort of the issue around transparency and some communities feeling like, maybe not that they were lied to, but that the government wasn't upfront about what it was doing with this money.
And the timing also doesn't seem great because, like you said, this has been the mill closures have been a story for 6 months or more now. And it seems kind of like the government hasn't paid that much attention to it. And when they have finally paid attention to it, they really aren't allocating any extra resources. They're just taking from one pot to give to another.
Yeah, and that's a phrase, I can't remember which mayor it was, but I think one of the mayors who was interviewed about the rural dividend sort of switcheroo characterized it as stealing from Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah, that's Williams Lake Mayor Walt Cobb.
Walt Cobb.
Yeah, and it's I think that's actually a pretty fair critique here. So, like, the government comes off looking pretty bad in this, I think, overall.
Yeah,
What is your perception of it?
Yeah, I don't think it's a good look. I mean, I think there's a lot of frustration by these communities. Not that, nobody could foresee this sort of issue coming with forestry in BC. The industry has not been particularly strong or healthy for basically as long as I've been alive. And I have family members that have been working in the industry for longer than I've been alive.
Part of my family comes from a mill town too. And yeah, the ups and downs of the forestry cycle is just a part of BC life. And but it has seemed to have gotten worse as well recently.
Yeah, and it's also probably going to keep getting worse before it gets better. Like I said, I think that the fact that a lot of the money that the province is directing towards sort of helping workers affected by this crisis is looking to get those who are sort of getting anywhere near retirement age. I think it's like either 50 and over or 55 and over, and sort of helping them get out of the industry a little bit early says a lot about sort of where the industry is going. I think the other piece of this is sort of the rural-urban divide that we talk about a lot in BC, and the fact that the NDP government, most of its MLAs are in urban ridings. A lot of them are here in the south and on the island, and many of the communities that are being affected by these closures are up north, and they're in the interior, and they're not represented by NDP MLAs. Most of them are represented by Liberals. There are some exceptions to that, our forest minister being one of them, up there in the Stikeen riding. But I think there's going to continue to be tension on this file for a while.
Yeah, the Liberals have really been pushing hard on this one. I think this has been kind of the main thrust of their critiques against the government over the course of the summer. And yeah, it's that urban NDP doesn't care about you has been the main talking point, or one of the main talking points by the Liberals. They haven't had a great answer to what would you do about it? But they've really been hammering the NDP on not doing anything about it.
And that is the thing you get to do in opposition. You don't have to offer the solutions because you are not the one charged with enacting them. What you get to do is criticize. So,
yeah, and the Liberals are certainly want to criticize. So going forward, the NDP said they were going to be taking the money from the rural dividend just to do this a lot faster. Is there any indication that coming up soon they're going to replenish the dividend and find some spare monies from somewhere else to cover off the temporary losses here?
I don't think that's in the cards for this year. I don't know what's going to happen next year. There are other ministries that are contributing to this fund. Notably, Labor is responsible for, I think it was about 12 million or so in program funding. Advanced education skills and training will be kicking in money for some of those retraining programs that are going to be offered to affected workers. So it's not just forestry that is going to be coming up with money for this. But I don't think the government has any plans to sort of find a way to have the rural dividend grant program pay out this year. Premier Horgan did say during a scrum with reporters, I think it was this week, that the government is going to try and find other funding streams for some of the applications. Williams Lake Mayor Walt Cobb participated in a news conference that the Liberals hosted with a bunch of local government officials expressing their concern about this funding drying up. And he was saying, look, we were relying on about $500,000 from this fund for a new water treatment plant. I guess Williams Lake's water has a lot of manganese in it, and they need a new treatment plant to fix that issue. And he said, this is a really bad year for us to be missing out on rural dividend grant funding. We need a water treatment plant. When the premier kind of came back and said, that's not what the rural dividend grant is for. This is major infrastructure. Water treatment is major infrastructure. And we can find other funding streams for stuff like that. So for some of these initiatives, some of these applications, the government may be looking to find other funding streams, but I don't think we're going to see anything coming from the rural dividend grant fund itself.
Okay, and how has the Green Party reacted to all this? No doubt they've been talking about the climate implications of this and the causes of that. But in terms of what to do about it going forward, how's the Green Party responded?
Well, I think that's something that we're going to see sort of unfold over the fall session. I did have a chat with Andrew Weaver at the Union of BC Municipalities conference, and he said that forestry is going to be a big priority for them this fall, figuring out sort of solutions to the forestry issue that also jive with the Green Party's prerogatives. He told me that the Greens don't like to just criticize. They want to have their own solutions ready to go. So we might see some of that coming out this fall. The other thing that Weaver said to me, he described the NDP's decision not to be forthright about sort of the funding switch as an unforced error. And he said he felt transparency would have gone a long way. You can get people on board, I think is what he said, if you're upfront about sort of what needs to be done in crisis situations like this.
Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to kind of two other related stories that have been dominating basically the past year.
It's the story that never ends.
Although it sounds like it might be starting to come to an end, as the two main people accused in the Legislature and Spence scandal are now both officially out of their positions. Trent James had left a while ago, and this week Gary Lenz announced he was resigning.
Yes, we got a statement from the Speaker's office right around 4:00, I think it was, on Tuesday, just saying that Lenz had resigned. Which was weird because Lenz had been cleared of any wrongdoing related to being a legislature employee by former Chief Justice of Canada's Supreme Court, Beverly McLaughlin. That came out in the spring. And she kind of cleared Lenz of any issues on that front. And he then said, I really want to get back to work. I want to come back and be the Sergeant at Arms at the BC Legislature. He had been on administrative leave since last November. And then all of a sudden we hear that he's gone. He's not coming back. He's retired. So yeah, that was a weird afternoon.
Yeah, I can imagine. So one thing I have seen in the coverage here is that there's expected to be another spin-off investigation that will be releasing its report from the, I believe it's the police board. And there's been a certain amount of speculation that may have influenced his decision? Do we have much more on that?
Not much at this point in time. I had clean forgotten about this investigation. There have been a lot of reports and audits and investigations going on related to these issues that the Speaker has brought up at the BC Legislature. But this came out also in the spring. I had a conversation with Opposition House Leader Mary Polak about it. And basically, there was a complaint made, I believe it was by Plexus's Chief of Staff, Alan Mullen, about potential violations under the Police Act, potentially by Lenz in his, because he's essentially the head of the legislature police force. That's what the Sergeant at Arms does. And this report will supposedly be released very soon. Now, Global News reported that Lenz had seen a copy of that report, and the suggestion was that that had caused him to retire rather than dealing with its fallout. But we have no timeline at this point for when the report might be released. I'm not sure whether the members of the Legislative Assembly Management Committee have seen that yet. They're sort of the ones who are handling all of these issues around the allegations that came out of the Speaker's report and looking into them and what to do with them. So yeah, there's at least one more report. Actually, there's a lot more reports that are going to come on this, and I do not share your optimism that this story is going to be winding down anytime soon.
Yeah, I guess there's also the RCMP investigation. Which has
been going on for over a year now with absolutely no updates, no further information, nothing that is publicly available. Yeah, and there's another report that will be coming from Mr. Mullen. He went...
Oh, another one of the spicy Speaker's office reports?
This is what he spent part of his summer doing, visiting various...
the road trip.
Yes, visiting various legislative precincts around sort of North America. He went into the States. He went back east all the way to Ontario. To talk with them about their policies and procedures, partly around security. And one of the things he told reporters last week was that he uncovered what he called unacceptable and out of whack spending related to security at the BC Legislature. So that also might be connected to Lenz, or it might have nothing to do with anything aside from the fact that maybe we've been spending a little bit much on security at the legislature. I don't know.
Okay. So when is the next time LAMC's going to be meeting to discuss this? Do we know yet?
That is a very good question. Give me 1 second here. I meant to look this up and then I forgot. So they did have a meeting, I believe it was last month. This is fun. They're meeting on Tuesday, according to the committee's calendar. LAMC is scheduled to meet on Tuesday, October 8th at 4 p.m. There's no agenda at this point in time, so we don't know what they'll be talking about. They could be reviewing Mr. Mullen's report. They could be reviewing this report related to the investigation under the Police Act, which is being conducted by a former Vancouver Transit Police Chief, Doug Lepard. I imagine they will also be talking about what is going to be happening going forward with the Auditor General's office, which also has a lot of work on its plate related to going over sort of the policies and procedures and everything that may or may not be going sideways at the BC Legislature. And our Auditor General also resigned last month. So
yeah, that was the other kind of slightly weird resignation. So it was a little early before the end of her term, as well as I think the resignation was filed, the day after the report about the legislature expenses came out.
I think it was in the same week, but I think there were a couple of days in between. Yes, so Auditor General Carol Bellringer tendered her resignation. She will be staying on until the end of the year to sort of help with the transition. And she also said she would be available afterwards, sort of if needed. And she cited personal reasons for leaving. So there is the possibility it's, a health issue or something else that has come up. But a lot of people have connected the dots to the speaker's sort of criticism of her last audit, which sort of in a similar way to former Chief Justice McLaughlin's report, Plecas was disappointed that there wasn't sort of a broader scope and a deeper investigation, a deeper look at what was going on.
You mean that it didn't have anyone vomiting from reading it?
So far, not a lot of vomiting coming out from any of these reports. Certainly the speaker's report that came out in January, which detailed all of these allegations, not all of which have a lot of sort of substance behind them. Some of them, several of them certainly were sort of dismissed out of hand by former Chief Justice McLaughlin, but there was some very sort of colorful descriptions of behavior by the former clerk and now retired Sergeant at Arms. Basically what the speaker said is that he thought there was going to be a forensic audit done, that there needs, that a forensic audit would be appropriate. But when the Auditor General announced her resignation, he also sort of released a statement, praising her work and thanking her for her service. So
it's hard to read into it too much.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that, everybody's going to draw their own conclusions, like happens so often with this story, because we get so little information about it. And I will just say that this legislature scandal is an incredibly frustrating story to cover. I always kind of grind my teeth when there's a new development because there's no reliable narrator here. Basically, everybody who's involved has a partisan angle or an axe to grind or their own, sort of crusade that they're on. And I find it very difficult at times to kind of make heads or tails out of who is in the right or who is doing good or how things are going there. So I think it's going to be one of those stories that we'll look back on it and be like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense now. But until we get through sort of all of this processing, it's going to be very difficult to do that. I certainly find it difficult to do that.
Yeah, the tell-all book will probably be great, but in the meantime, it's annoying to
in the meantime, it's turning my hair white. Not even joking.
Okay, well, let's jump into what to expect starting next week when the legislature comes back. So they've been off for a while. We'll begin a throne speech. Is there a throne speech at the start of this one?
No.
Right, yes.
So that should be when we come back in the spring, because it's usually just ahead of the budget. So this session will basically be in continuation of the last session. There's actually a piece of government legislation that is still on the order paper, still needs to finish going through the process. That is the Community Safety Amendment Act, introduced by the Public Safety Minister and Solicitor General Mike Farnworth. So that one will need to go through the process. And sorry, let me just pull up the description here so I know what this one actually talks about. Yeah, so this legislation is designed to sort of tackle problem properties and make it sort of easier for people who have concerns that, say, a house may be used for like drug selling or production or whatever, to have that looked into and potentially, have it removed, not the house itself, but like have, the issue settled, the people removed from it.
Right. So this would tie into the asset forfeiture system. Yeah.
So it kind of like on the surface looks like it's related to the Civil Forfeiture Amendment Act, which passed in the spring session. And there has been some criticism of like both of these bills as being sort of an overreach and, people potentially being targeted who don't necessarily deserve to be targeted. Our public safety minister, though, sort of says, it's an issue of public safety. And if you don't want to have the government take your stuff. Don't get involved in illegal activities. I believe he was once asked in the hallway about sort of concerns about the Civil Forfeiture Act and said, if you're doing something illegal with your car, we're going to take your car. That's just how it works. So, and that bill, so the Community Safety Amendment Act, yeah, so it's at second reading. So it really hasn't gone very far at all at this point in time. But we did have sort of a jam-packed spring session, and the budget sucks a lot of air out of the room when it comes to like time to debate legislation and stuff like that.
Right. So that's the main piece that's kind of carried over from the last session, but we're also expecting a bunch of other legislation to be announced or brought forward. I think the big one everyone has their eye on is UNDRIP. The province has said they want to proceed with legislation to enact that. And from what I've heard, it's expected to be in this session, correct?
Yes. The Premier has mentioned it a couple times now over the summer that it's coming this fall. Last year, we were under the impression it was coming during the spring session, and then that didn't happen. The big question in my mind for this legislation, which I think is going to be really interesting to watch, is whether it's going to be a single bill or whether they're going to have a bunch of pieces of legislation sort of targeting various laws that already exist, and whether there's going to be a bunch of amendments that go through or whether it's going to be sort of one overarching piece of legislation. I think this is going to be very consequential and certainly something that I don't think any other jurisdiction in the country has done. The federal government...
So I don't believe any of them have moved forward on that because it is, I think, quite a fraught bit of legislation. Most provinces have probably been waiting for the federal government to start to enact it before and take their cues from that.
Yes, and I think that's sort of very much been the mood elsewhere. But as I am frequently reminded when talking about sort of issues around Indigenous rights and reconciliation, BC is kind of in a unique position within Canada because we have very little land in the provinces under treaty. Most of it was never ceded by First Nations. There are no agreements for, government's use or sort of appropriation of it. And there have been some significant court battles fought on that issue where First Nations have succeeded in sort of defending their right to the hereditary territories that they've been living on for millennia.
Yeah, so this will no doubt be quite an interesting one to watch. And it probably will also end up being, depending on what's in it, fairly controversial as well. Because no doubt, particularly related to resource projects, how that intersects is probably going to be quite fraught.
Yes, one of the big things I think a lot of people are wondering is the issue or the phrase that everybody seems to use is like Indigenous veto or First Nations veto. Like if we are conceding as sort of parts of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples does that, Indigenous people have a right to determine what happens on their land. Are they going to be able to veto projects that they don't like? And what is that going to mean if their territory abuts or overlaps with an Indigenous group that wants a project to go forward and, that has signed benefit agreements or that wants to participate in that development? Sorry.
Yeah, because there's no monolithic view on how resource projects should go ahead. So there's kind of a lot of differences there. And I also believe part of the reason why Canada has been a little slow to implement this is because a bunch of our own laws and kind of constitutional arrangements don't neatly align with UNDRIP. So how that has to do, because it's like the veto issue, from my understanding of how the Supreme Court's ruled on it, is there isn't one, but there are significant consultation requirements, and what that means going forward if UNDRIP does get enacted and how those intersect is going to be quite interesting. There's a lot of work to figure out how that
and the
goes.
government, the BC government has been working on this legislation for about a year now. I believe the premier announced that it would be coming around this time last year, and sort of intimated that it would be introduced during the spring session, and then it has, carried over to the fall. So I would assume there's been a lot of work done on this piece of legislation, and a lot of consultation with, the various First Nations here. And the BC government has already sort of engaged in government to government relations with First Nations groups within sort of the provincial boundary, which is something that UNDRIP also sort of lays out. So in certain ways, they've already been moving in this direction, but it will be a significant step to pass legislation that does sort of enshrine UNDRIP in provincial law, and a first in Canada.
And moving on to the other thing that's gathered quite a bit of headlines is daylight savings time. Sounds like there's going to be a bill that's going to potentially get rid of it. Oh, yeah. Eternal daylight savings time.
Yeah, to me, no, it would preserve it. We would stay on daylight savings time all year round. Yes, daylight savings time forever. The thing that makes me laugh about these two is they seem to be like on opposite ends of the significance scale. Like, that's definitely my own personal take, but the daylight savings thing to me just kind of makes me roll my eyes. Then again, I do not have children. All of my colleagues who have kids, and so many people I know that have kids, are like, daylight savings time is the worst. Children don't know when the clocks change, so they get me up at, the wee hours of the morning, or they're very upset and grumpy about being woken up early. And certainly the province did a consultation on this issue. It was the biggest buy-in, the most participation of like any consultation supposedly that the province has ever done. And not only that,
200,000 or more British Columbians
nearly 250,000 people.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why this is just drawing so much attention is one of those like small little annoyances that everybody has an opinion on, and it's simple enough that everyone feels fairly confident talking about it, whereas something like UNDRIP is super complex and almost nobody knows, what to think of all the intricacies of that, where everybody has a, crap, do I have to change the clocks again moment?
Yeah, and when you have to do that one that's on like your ancient stove and you don't really know what dial it is or like what button to push. The thing that gets me though is that, you do public consultation, and I've looked at quite a few of these. Everybody's got a different opinion. Like, you rarely have consensus on like any issue under the sun. And yet the biggest public buy-in to a consultation in the province's history, supposedly, 93% of people want us to stay on daylight savings time all year round. 93% of the people who weighed in were like, yes, this is the way we should go. Let's do it this way.
Yeah, that's shocking. You can't get 93% of British Columbians to agree on anything.
No, except for that we should stay on daylight savings time. Now, the wrinkle here is that it would be kind of weird if just BC stayed on daylight saving time forever and ever. And one of the things that the premier has talked about a lot is the fact that the 3 Pacific Coast states, Washington State, Oregon, and California, have either passed legislation or, in California's case, gone through a referendum to support staying on daylight savings time, which would be very convenient because then you have, sort of the whole Pacific Coast in Canada and the U.S. on the same time zone. The wrinkle there is that in the U.S., you have to get congressional approval in order to make that change to remain on daylight savings time. And
that's fine. Congress is famously productive.
I know, so functional, right?
And they have nothing big on their plate right now to take any attention away.
They have really, really nothing better to do than just like give the states this green light. Now, apparently, and I didn't have time to go through President Donald Trump's Twitter feed today, but during a news conference that Premier Horgan co-hosted with Washington State Governor Jay Inslee, Horgan said that Trump tweeted in all caps, as he is wont to do, that daylight savings is a great idea and they should do that. So who knows? Like, maybe it'll become the president's like pet project as he tries to distract from this impeachment inquiry. And he's like, daylight savings time forever on the Pacific coast. The other thing is that apparently the Yukon is very on board with staying on daylight savings time all year round. So, you know.
Right, because, Horgan was up there just this past week to talk with their premier.
He was, the beginning of the week.
And he stopped there by him. Yeah.
And they talked about that. And Yukon Premier Sandy Silver said, it sounds like a good idea, but all of the politicians I've heard talk about it this week, Governor Inslee and Premiers Horgan and Silver, all sort of said, this would be best if we did it all together. So we may see the legislation pass this fall and then not go anywhere for a year or two. To my mind, if we're going to stay on daylight savings time, what would make the most sense is to go through a time change in the spring and then just never, ever change the clocks ever again. So earliest this could possibly happen would be next March. But I wouldn't bet on that.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you have your eye on in the upcoming session?
I hate making predictions about legislation because you really just never know like what is going to happen in the House. And there's so many different things going on. The government has consultations going on everything from agriculture to forestry. I think there might be some potential regulatory changes to some other legislation coming, but the one that is on my radar because it was introduced very late in the last session and then got sort of quite a bit of traction is potentially a ban on conversion therapy here in BC.
Right, there's a Green Party bill that was brought forward.
Green Party leader Andrew Weaver introduced it, I believe, in the very last week of the spring session. So at that point, he knew, it wasn't going to go anywhere, at least that spring.
Right. And if I recall, the reaction from the NDP was surprisingly cold, or at least not particularly enthusiastic about it. Well, is there any indication that's changing?
I think the thing that they really wanted to do was kind of set the record straight about the fact that like conversion therapy is not supported by the government. It's not considered, a legitimate form of therapy. It's not covered by MSP, medical practitioners who decide they want to, have their patients undergo conversion therapy can't bill the province for it and be compensated. And if they did do that, if they, put in another code for their services to be reimbursed by the province, and it was discovered that what they were doing was conversion therapy, that would be considered fraud. So that was something that the health minister came out and sort of was very specific about. But it is also an issue that I think a lot of people just kind of feel is common sense. Maybe not quite common sense, but like that formalizing that ban and the fact that, being gay is not a disease. It's not something that you need to get treatment for. And you shouldn't be sort of like some of the stuff that goes on in conversion therapy basically verges on or can verge on what a lot of people would consider torture and can be very destructive. So, saying like we are against conversion therapy doesn't seem like that far of a leap. At the same time, I think the government has sort of come out and said like it would really be a formality because we already, we don't support this with provincial money. We do not agree that it's, a valid form of therapy. The other reason it's kind of been on my radar is because it was something that was sort of on the radar in Alberta. The NDP government has sort of taken steps along that line, and then the UCP government has really backed away from it, and there's been some criticism of that. So, plus, Andrew Weaver has had some success with his many, many, many private members' bills. So if there's any private members' bill that's going to go forward, I would say it would be one of his.
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye out for that in the coming session. Well, moving on to our second segment, the election continues. So we're basically at the halfway point. I think we crossed over it a couple days ago. In the 40-day election period that feels like closer to 40 years.
Oh, my God.
Even though it was only a couple weeks ago, actually, when you were last on here, when the writ dropped. But it's...
I know, it had just kicked off, and we were talking about writ dropping all over the place.
But it's really turned into a slog at this point. There have been a few controversies, but overall, the polls have been surprisingly stable. There's basically been no movement over the past 2 months beyond the statistical noise one would expect.
Which kind of blows my mind when I think about the fact that we have now seen multiple pictures of our prime minister in blackface. Like, the fact that that really hasn't moved the needle just speaks to how sort of bizarre and frustrating this election is.
Yeah, well, if you kind of squint at CBC's poll tracker, you can see a temporary dip and divergence between the Liberals and the Conservatives during that week. But yeah, it's basically not changed anything, which I guess, well, what do you think that even says about Canada, that, you know, stuff that should be a major scandal and was treated as a scandal just doesn't shift people's voting intentions at all?
I don't know. It's depressing as hell. I think part of it is that, you know, there is sort of a stark divide and a polarization in a lot of ways, I think, between sort of not the various parties, but I guess what most people would consider sort of the more progressive parties and what most people would consider. And I mean, they are the conservative parties. I mean, I think the thing that I was actually very interested watching Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer react to the images of Trudeau in blackface. And I thought it was interesting that he sort of didn't, at least initially, really come out hard on the racism angle because, you know, blackface is racist regardless of what you sort of intend or thought at the time or whatever. It's racist. It was always racist. It will always be racist. But what Scheer sort of came out and said is that Trudeau isn't as advertised. He's not, you know, this progressive, sort of dreamy prime minister. He is not as advertised, which then became kind of a weird and not so great angle for Scheer when it also came out that, like, he wasn't as advertised because he was never an insurance broker, which is sort of the only thing that he's ever touted as having done outside of politics. Yeah, like, I find it really depressing, but I think, you know, for a lot of people who, you know, are liberal supporters or are consider themselves progressive voters, they don't really feel like they have an alternative to continuing to, say, support the Liberals, which I don't think is necessarily true and I think is really frustrating and depressing, but they're worried about the possibility of a conservative government. They don't think that the NDP is strong enough to come through as government, and so they stick with the Liberals, despite the fact that, you know, their leader has been seen multiple times in blackface and can't even tell us how many times he has worn blackface and culturally offensive costumes because it's just happened so many times in his life. I also, like, I found it really tough to watch Andrew Scheer be asked multiple times if he wanted, because credit where it's due, Trudeau did apologize. He apologized. He acknowledged that it was a racist thing to do, that it was a hurtful thing to do, that it's disappointing, blah, blah, blah. And so then Scheer was asked, you know, would you like to apologize for statements that you made in the House in 2005 that sort of drew this weird line and made this weird metaphor about, like, gay marriage being part of inferior canine anatomy? And he was given multiple opportunities to say, yes, I regret that. I've changed my mind. That was insulting to gay people. That was a homophobic statement. And he just said, no, I don't. And then sort of pivoted back to Trudeau's issue. So just all around, it's been really sort of depressing. And I'm not feeling particularly inspired about this election at all.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be the mood that a lot of people are in, that nothing being discussed, even if it's important, really feels that consequential, or has the gravitas one would expect of an election.
Yeah, it's there's definitely not the same sort of enthusiasm, and I hesitate to say excitement, but something like excitement that we were seeing back in 2015.
Yeah, the parties are really kind of stuck in a bit of a rut where they're just kind of taking whatever shot they can at each other without really, laying out a great vision of what they want for the country, or really producing interesting or innovative policies.
No, I mean, we have the platforms now, and honestly, those aren't particularly inspiring either from my point of view. Maybe I'm just too much of a cynic, but I was like, okay, but nothing to sort of, I think change people's minds about who they were going to vote for. It's all kind of as expected.
Yeah, even the smaller parties that in theory have the space to be a little more risk-taking haven't really seized on that at all, and are kind of falling back into the well-worn treads that their party's comfortable with.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, every little weird thing that can become a controversy does. And there was the insurance thing with Andrew Scheer, but then today there's this whole blow up around whether or not he has dual citizenship, and in the process of renouncing it, which honestly, it just seems like such a small potatoes thing. It's hard to get the sense that the parties are really taking this election all that seriously, or talking to Canadians in a serious manner when this is the thing they're focusing on.
Well, it's one of those things that literally would not be a thing if the Conservatives and Scheer himself hadn't previously made comments about prominent Canadians who hold dual citizenship, and sort of been critical and painted that as a negative thing. So there's a lot of sort of exposition of hypocrisy and spotlights on politicians' hypocrisy in this election, which doesn't make for inspiring, it doesn't inspire voters, or certainly it doesn't inspire me. I don't, people can be hypocritical, and politics is one of those things that can really make you cynical. But this...
Yeah, there's a certain amount of situational positioning on a lot of these things. And yeah, you're absolutely right that switch the parties around and who has dual citizenship and who doesn't, the parties would just switch their position on whether or not that's good or bad.
Yeah.
And especially because we don't have a system like Australia does, where it's actually part of the law that they can't run for office if they're a dual citizen, which has led to great scandals, such as a scandal over whether or not someone is secretly Canadian.
Oh no, a secret Canadian.
Yeah, there have been legitimate scandals in Australian politics over people hiding Canadian citizenship and stuff, which I just find amusing.
Yeah, that is kind of funny. I mean, one thing I will say, I was having a conversation with some people last night, some of whom are partisan, many of whom are sort of very plugged into politics. And the general consensus was that so far, the person in this election who really looks the best is federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, and that he seems the most a normal human being who has human being reactions to situations and isn't just always on message and regurgitating sort of party talking points. He seems like a genuine person.
Yeah, or at least, the second part also does describe Elizabeth May, but it's not quite the same. And yeah, Jagmeet Singh definitely comes across as, I think, the most authentically just a decent guy or decent person in this, which is good. But at the same time, there's a lot more goes into deciding who runs the country than the would you have a beer with him test.
Yeah, although that does go a long way for some people.
Yeah, but like that was the thing with George W. He was like the most down-to-earth votes he got guy of the candidates. Like, it just shows that I think there's a lot more that goes into making a good leader of a country than that. But yeah, I think Singh's definitely standing out on the personal level, but in terms of policies and stuff, I think the NDP still has a way to go.
Honestly, I think everybody still has a way to go on the policy thing, like especially when it comes to climate change issues and the environment. Actually, Horgan was saying today during his news conference with Inslee that this is something the federal leaders really need to take seriously. And I think he said something along the lines of like, I know that they all are in their own ways. But then he also said, I want to see more policy discussion in the last couple of weeks that we have here before we go to the polls, given that the past couple have sort of been about like, I think he said personality and gaffes, which I guess is a charitable way to describe wearing blackface multiple times.
Or resume padding, I guess.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, there are platforms and that gives us something more to talk about. Even if I don't find them inspiring.
Yeah, so let's switch over to that. Now that we're trying to discuss the more personal dynamics of the race so far. So the Liberals put out their platform over the weekend. I think it dropped Sunday morning. And like you hinted at, it's mostly full of fairly typical, if uninspiring, Liberal Party stuff. There's a targeted program for pretty much everyone in there.
Plant all the trees.
Yes, they're going to plant a lot of trees, 2 billion trees, which I assume they mean 2 billion more because someone was quick to point out that Canada plants a little over 2 billion already.
Yeah, so an increase would be good. Although, wouldn't be the first time parties have sort of campaigned on something that was already going on and billed it as new.
Yeah. So something else, there's a couple other little things in there that caught my eye. And one of them was they apparently want to study or start putting money towards a tunnel between Newfoundland and Labrador.
Yeah, I saw that one.
It's such a weird little way. It's also the only like specific infrastructure commitment in the entire platform, which is also kind of weird. Is it?
Like, I don't know. I don't know much about Atlantic Canada. Is this something that people are really keen on out there? Like, is it is this pandering or?
I think it's a little like the bridge to Vancouver Island thing. Like there's some people who are really keen on it. Although this one's actually technically feasible, unlike the bridge to Vancouver Island. But like it's that same sort of like there's a small niche group that this is catnip for, and it doesn't really matter if it doesn't make a lot of sense financially. Yeah,
I mean, like I often am looking at campaigns from sort of the bird's eye view, but that the parties are both doing the bird's eye view and looking at like on a riding by riding basis. So, that could be it. There's people in Atlantic Canada that really, really, really want a tunnel. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess so. But I think there's only something like, 27,000 people in Labrador. So it's not a huge, it's one riding.
Fun.
I guess maybe there's a couple they could pick up on the other side of the strait too. So there's that. There's also promises for a pilot program for low emission oil tankers, which I think might be the most centrist thing ever said.
Could be up there. But, you don't want to have like crazy emissions screwing up your like GHG targets while you're shipping fossil fuels all over the place. That would just not be a good look.
No, not at all. Was there anything else that caught your eye in that?
I was really interested by the reaction to the funding for camping.
Okay, right, yeah.
For, lower income families to be able to, get out and get into the great outdoors. It surprised me how many people came down really negatively on that, both in the, this is silly and ridiculous, which, I mean, okay, I think you can make that argument. And also, like, why can't you make this funding be for, like, very, necessary services, like whether it's going towards, I don't know, an income tax adjustment or some kind of credit or something like that. And I was just surprised by how many people were like really down on that. To me, I was like, yeah, okay, like it's not a very serious policy platform, but if you're just scraping by, it could be nice to be able to get out of, wherever you are living in, say, an urban center and be able to take the kids out to like the nearest national park or something. It struck me sort of the cynicism around it. And it surprised me the strong reaction that some people had to that platform plank.
Yeah, well, I think it plays a bit into the perceptions of Trudeau as not a particularly serious person who just, likes to spend a bunch of time outside. It doesn't have like deep policy chops or anything.
No.
So I think it played into that perception a bit.
Yeah, I could see that. Did he show up to that campaign announcement in the canoe? Was that where the canoe?
Yes, that was the campaign announcement.
That might have been part of it too.
Yeah, the optics were very much that, Trudeau was having a good time camping and wants other people to also have a good time camping. So he's going to throw a bunch of money around for it, I think. And yeah, and on the policy front, like it just doesn't make a huge amount of sense to do that versus just a cash transfer that low-income families could use to go camping if they wanted or could use for something else.
That's true.
And it does have that slightly paternalistic approach to it that, the government knows best, and what it knows best for you is to go camping rather than spend that money on something else.
Yeah, I don't have any particular sort of quibble with criticism of it. I was just kind of surprised by like the intensity and whatever. But again, the canoe stunt probably played into that a bit too.
Yeah, but at least it's better than showing up on a jet ski. So points there, I guess. Well, speaking of showing up on jet skis, let's pivot over to the Conservatives.
Yay!
So their big announcement this week was that they were going to be slashing foreign aid, including to all those high-income countries that were apparently given billions of dollars away to.
Yeah, just all of the money to the high-income countries.
Yeah, that was the most puzzling thing about that was the inclusion of this idea that we're apparently, in addition to giving some money to middle-income countries, which I suppose could make sense, those would be countries like Mexico, Argentina, a bunch of like the Latin American countries or African countries that could probably use some help but aren't like at the very bottom. And you could quibble about whether or not that makes sense to fund. But yeah, there's also just this weird talking point about high-income countries that we're apparently giving money to, which makes absolutely no sense. So I'm pretty sure we're not paying Denmark a bunch of money for stuff.
Or Sweden. Sending all the money to Sweden. Yeah, I mean, not surprising, like sort of very much on brand, I think, for Conservatives to talk about the need to, spend money on issues that are sort of facing Canadians here at home rather than sending that money overseas. On the other side of things, there are a lot of places on this planet where it is really a lot more difficult to live a decent life than it is here in Canada. And as global citizens, maybe we should be doing our part. I don't think we're even a particularly like large, on a per capita basis that our foreign aid spending is sort of exorbitant at this point in time. But
no. So yeah, CBC has a graph on their article, which we'll link in the show notes. So the UN target is 0.7% of GDP, and we're sitting around, it's like about 0.3.
Wow. Way to go, Canada.
Yeah, it's not the only international target that we're not great at hitting either. So guess that's par for the course.
The other
0.28%.
0.28. So we're not even approaching half of what the target, the benchmark that the UN sets.
Yeah.
Wow, that's kind of embarrassing.
Interestingly, Luxembourg crosses that line as well as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, but they're pretty much the only ones
Yeah, and Luxembourg is literally a place where you can stand on one border and you can like see where the other border is. I've been there. I have done that. So it doesn't really surprise me. Yeah, no, like I said, I think that's very on brand for the Conservatives. But it's also would just be very sort of embarrassing for us to be so far away from that UN benchmark if we reduced our aid contributions further.
Yeah, so it'll probably appeal to the base. I'm not just going to win much support beyond that. But kind of the other thing that made news was that Andrew Scheer wants to reverse the Liberals' changes to how Senate appointments are made and kind of return to the more traditional approach.
Traditional.
Yeah, as in pick partisans, appoint them to the Senate. As long as they clear the, $4,000 of property requirement and are wear the right color shirt, they're good to go.
Patronage. So good for democracy. Yeah.
So to, I guess, give the best possible interpretation of this one, the Liberals' moves haven't gone incredibly smooth with the Senate, and they've had a bunch of problems getting legislation through because, well, now you have a bunch of people acting all independently, and it's hard to actually just drive the legislation. And there's been kind of, as the Senate's been given more legitimacy through a more independent process, they've also, started acting as if they've had more legitimacy and being a lot more active in the legislative process than before. So you could definitely make the argument that returning to, I guess, a slightly less legitimate way of distributing power might temper some of the Senate's recent impulses that haven't always gone the way they necessarily should.
Less legitimacy, more convenience.
Something like that. Sounds
like a good trade-off when we're talking about legislation.
Yeah, how the Senate goes forward from here, I think it's going to be something that's going to be interesting to watch because the Liberals definitely haven't worked the kinks out of their new system yet. So, I don't know. We'll have to see. And, with the NDP, they've, I think, reiterated their promise that they just won't appoint senators, which is probably unconstitutional. So, most parties aren't great when it comes to the Senate.
And also the Senate isn't great, so just...
Yeah, it could use some reform, but when the Supreme Court came to that in, I want to say 2008, and said that we actually have to do a constitutional amendment to make real significant changes, that kind of took the wind out of the sails on that one. And I don't think anybody wants to try that now.
No, just seems like too big of a mountain to try and climb. I think it's been interesting. Well, I've been interested watching the NDP because it does seem like, of course, Jagmeet Singh's seat is here in BC, in Burnaby South. And he's spent quite a bit of time here. He was at the climate strike at the BC Legislature last week. And he was here at the legislature, and then he got on a ferry and announced $30 million in funding to reduce ferry fares, sort of keep the ferries more affordable, which is a little bit like the Liberal promise on the tunnel in Newfoundland. Very specific to BC and also very specific in a lot of ways to Vancouver Island. As a lifelong islander, basically anytime I want to leave and explore either the continental United States or the rest of Canada, I have to get on a ferry. So definitely something that speaks to a very sort of niche group of people. Yeah,
he's definitely learned something about BC politics. Because, I grew up on the island, and the ferries are a constant source of discussion. And Yeah, there's a whole ferry politics around that he's clearly leaning into. And BC Ferries does get a subsidy from the federal government. I think it's around 28 million. So this would be a fairly significant influx of cash to it.
Yeah, I think it was in that neighborhood. But yeah, I don't remember ever seeing certainly during sort of recent elections, political leaders on the ferry. It doesn't, like if you're the leader of a federal party, you tend to like get on a plane and just sort of skip the whole, because it takes 10 times as long almost to make the ferry crossing as it does to just get on a harbor air flight or something like that.
Yeah, it's quick. I think airport to airport, it's like 20 minutes, including all the taxiing and everything, which takes half the time. Like, it's a quick
Yeah,
flight.
and you're like 2 hours dock to dock just about by the time you're unloading on the ferry. So, significant time sink there. What else in the NDP platform have you been looking at?
So 2 other announcements this week. We're going to be saving the full platform stuff for the last week's show before the election. So we'll be doing a deep dive on that. We've kind of talked about the NDP platform when they've released their kind of version 1 of it over the summer. But this week, what they announced, they wanted to spend $100 million to keep youth out of gangs, with most of that going to stuff like after-school programs, sports stuff, basically alternative activities for youth to do. And they've want to spend $10 billion to generate a lot of new child spaces across the country for a total of 500,000 of them. The details on how you get the provinces on board still doesn't seem to be super clear on that, because it's a provincial issue and you can give a bunch of money, but will Doug Ford, for example, necessarily accept that and set up his own program? It's kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think that is an open question.
Yeah, so both of these I think are fairly standard NDP commitments, the type of thing they've been running on more or less since at least I've been alive, and probably longer. Same thing with farmer care. And I think that kind of goes through what we were talking about at the start of the segment, where there's just all the parties are kind of in familiar ground, more or less, that aren't really kind of pushing very far outside of their traditional ideas.
Yeah, everybody's on brand when it comes to the policy and the platform.
Well, the only ones who are maybe trying a few different things, and that hasn't always worked out super great, is the Green Party. The one announcement I saw from them this week was a robot tax.
Tax all the robots.
Yeah, so this was something Elizabeth May proposed earlier in the week. Basically, the idea was to levy a tax on robots. Exactly what that means is a little up in the air, and we'll get to that in a moment. And basically use that funding to offset automation-induced job loss.
Which, on the surface, makes a lot of sense, right? Automation keeps coming. People lose their jobs. Forestry is one of those industries where a lot of jobs have gone to automation. We have self-driving trucks that are showing up in the oil sands. On its face, to me, it sounded like, that kind of makes sense. That seems like not a bad idea on its face.
So it's the sort of thing that I think falls into the common sense ideas that a lot of people see when they read stories about increasing automation stuff. I think it's when you dive into it a little more, it gets to be a bit more questionable. So historically, there's been a lot of predictions that technology is going to lead to unemployment, all the way back to the start of the Industrial Revolution and the Luddites, who smashed, I think, mechanical looms was the thing they were most mad at. Yeah, that's the origin of the word Luddite. But none of those predictions have necessarily come true. And the general view that economists take on this is that the increasing productivity there basically allows resources to be redirected elsewhere in the economy, and people take on different jobs, not less jobs. And I've seen a lot of them liken this to tats in light bulbs to pay for lamplighters and stuff. And that, I think, is the other concern here, is that it wouldn't be a tax on productivity improving technology. And that's probably something we don't necessarily want to do in Canada. Like our productivity growth has basically been non-existent for the past 10 to 20 years, which isn't great when you want to kind of grow the economy and make everyone's better off, because like most of our economic growth has come from a growing population, not necessarily the fact that we're able to do more with the same number of people. And that, I think, is a big concern when you look at an aging population, the fact that more and more of every working person's output's going to have to support a larger number of retirees and people using the healthcare system, and a lot of this spending that just doesn't have as many workers to support anymore. And to kind of make that not just be crushing to the next generation, everybody needs to be able to just produce more in the economy more effectively. And, automation's going to be a big help there in increasing productivity. So like this might be the thing that might perhaps smooth things out a bit more, get a little more revenue for kind of an initial change, if that's even going to be a major disruption of employment, but it might be a long run a bad idea.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing. Like I said, when I first heard about it, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then you see some of the analysis and some of the reaction, you're like, oh, like hadn't thought about that angle or like that particular impact, which is often the way policy goes. Like you hear about it in sort of a simple form and are like, yeah, that sounds awesome. And then when you look at the broader scope, you're like, oh, that's more complicated than I thought it was going to be. Also, what counts as a robot? Like that was the other thing that I saw brought up a lot around this. Like what precisely is the definition? Because robot can mean sort of a varied spectrum of machines and things that make our lives easier.
Yeah, like a lot of the automation that is impacting stuff. I mean, some of it is stuff like self-driving cars, but a lot of it is just computer systems.
Yeah, software.
And is it Excel? Would that be taxed? I mean, it put the people who did spreadsheets by hand out of work in a lot of cases, but is that enough to be considered a robot? And here in Metro Vancouver, we have the SkyTrain system, which I think by any reasonable definition, it could be considered a robot. Would the Green Party be taxing transit in this case? I mean, that doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but that's also the problem with these tricky definitions.
That's what legislation is for, hashing out all of the details.
Yeah, so other than that, I haven't seen a huge amount from the Green Party this past week. But like I said, last episode before the election, we'll be doing a deep dive on the party's platforms, and probably dedicate the whole episode to doing a comparison there, so we'll no doubt have more. And in the meantime, on October 7th, the English language debate. I believe the French debate might actually be happening right now while we're recording. There's also an unofficial...
No, that was yesterday,
There was the unofficial one yesterday.
Okay.
The commission... They also have a commission's debate as well. That'll be happening. So there's been two official French debates and one... There's one official French debate, one unofficial debate that everyone participated in anyway. And the English language one will be on the 7th.
Yes, it will.
And yep.
I am not going to watch it.
Other than that, what do you... Pardon?
I am not going to watch it. I am going to go and eat steak and celebrate my brother-in-law's birthday. So...
Okay, that's might actually be more fun.
Oh, I think I'm going to have way more fun than anybody who watches the debate. But what are you looking out for? Are you going to watch it?
I will definitely be watching it. I mean, I don't have high hopes that those debates tend to just be a lot of talking points, but it'll be interesting to see how the leaders, I guess, react to each other. And I think more importantly, or at least I'm going to be curious to see what the outcome of that is, and will something happen that will actually dislodge the polls from their incredibly static position?
Could be. We won't know until after it happens.
So yeah, that's kind of what I'll be watching for in the next week. No doubt there'll be some other oppo dump that will take out a lot of oxygen from the conversation, but hopefully we'll actually have a chance for the leaders to really debate, policy rather than these kind of gotcha stuff.
We'll see.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on to Twit Takes. You put out a story earlier this week about how Ontario is no longer going to be classifying films themselves that are apparently just given the job to BC. Maybe.
Yeah, we are. BC will eventually have a monopoly on film classification in Canada the way things are going. This was a funny little story because back when I was a university student, I actually worked as a co-op student for BC's film classification office, which at the time was part of the Ministry of, I believe it was the Solicitor General. Anyways, so I knew a little bit about film classification, and we got this announcement. I have colleagues out in Ontario, so this was sort of made possible by the fact that I was made aware of what Ontario was doing with its film classification regulations and my knowledge of how film classification works in BC. And so Ontario is looking at this as a cost-cutting measure. They're going to outsource their film classification to BC, and But
there's apparently a slight wrinkle, which, seems to be the common theme with a lot of Doug Ford's moves, that maybe BC hasn't agreed to it yet.
Yes, that was the weird thing. So they put out this regulatory change on Thursday afternoon last week with the announcement that the Ontario Film Authority is closing its doors as of October 1st, Tuesday. So only 2 business days. And they say this, change is going to happen. And the wording of the regulation was what caught my eye because it said that Ontario was going to accept BC's film classification. And I was like, well, that's not really how that works. Because when I was at the film classification office, we had an agreement with Manitoba. And it was an agreement. It's like a contract. It's a legal document. There's a fee structure. BC collects fees from film distributors for classifying films both here in BC and in Manitoba. And so I was curious as to, whether Ontario had previously hammered out this agreement or, BC publicly posts its classification of films on a website, the Consumer Protection BC website. And part of me was like, does Ontario just think that they can pull the classifications off the website for free? And that's how they're going to do this. And it kind of sounds like maybe that's what they thought they were going to do. Consumer Protection BC put out a statement saying, we are working on this agreement sort of thing. And I confirmed with them that there is no agreement in place at this point in time, or rather as of publication yesterday. And they don't yet know what a potential agreement with Ontario is going to look like, which then begs the question, what are film distributors in Ontario going to do in the meantime? Because you're not allowed to just send your film to theaters and have them run it without it having been viewed and classified for things like coarse language and sexual content and, other things that people might get upset about or find offensive to watch in a movie. And we don't know. Nobody would answer those questions. Consumer Protection BC said, they don't have anything further to say until they reach an agreement with Ontario. And Ontario just told me that they're working diligently to get an agreement in place.
Right. And just to be clear, the film classifications are copyrighted, so they can't just pull them off the website. They actually have to go through the full proper process of having the agreement in place before they can use anything, right?
Yes. And so BC charges Manitoba $2 a minute to review films for a minimum charge of $220. Saskatchewan, I believe, pays significantly more than that. I think it was in the neighborhood of $400 or so, but that was per film, sort of regardless. So for longer movies, it might be a better deal, and for shorter ones, not such a good deal.
So it saved Marvel a few dollars on Endgame,
yeah,
perhaps.
So it's going to be...
Because they really need to save the money.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens with this going forward. And also, Ontario has billed this as a cost-saving measure, both for the government of Ontario, not, doing this work anymore, and for film distributors. It says it's going to be, cheaper and easier for them to get things done, get that classification for their films. Quick little side note, because I had very mixed feelings about this. One of the things we found out while we were digging through the annual reports from Consumer Protection BC is that the Film Classification Office, and part of my job when I was there, was actually watching pornography. Pornography that would either be exhibited publicly in a dedicated porn theater, or...
Do they still have those?
Well, here's the thing. Or that would be sold like on DVD at a sex shop. And part of me is very sad about this. They have not had to classify any adult film content since 2016. So
maybe the Brits were right about technological unemployment.
There is no more porn going through the Film Classification Office, which part of me, the nostalgic part of me, the twisted part of me is kind of sad about that. And on the other hand, I'm very relieved on behalf of anybody who's still classifying films at the Film Classification Office, not having to do that.
Oh, that's a little interesting side fact. Yeah, the other thing that surprised me about this was that there were just different film classification things across Canada. I'd always assumed that because, you see the same rating system in each province, that it was just one thing for all of Canada, because why go through 10 different ratings? But I guess because our federation's this weird dispersed thing, we have all these, each province does their own thing.
Yeah, and there is provincial legislation involved. So provinces in BC, I believe it's called the Motion Picture Act. And I mean, BC is kind of cornering the market. If we ink this deal with Ontario, we'll be doing film classification for 4 provinces.
And I think a majority of Canadians, too.
Yeah, I would be interested. I guess so. Between like all 4, I mean, Ontario is the most populous province, so add in BC, and then you've got Manitoba and Saskatchewan as well. So yeah, we would be offering classifications for the majority of Canadians, at least until next spring. Ontario is apparently looking at potentially overhauling its own legislation and might then bring classification back in-house. I believe the Atlantic provinces also all band together and have one board or one authority that is offering ratings out there.
That would make sense. They do share a lot of services between them. Mm-hmm. Like I know their lottery corporation thing's a joint venture between them, and there's a few other ones like that. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So
because it doesn't. Why would PEI pay for the thing for the 130,000 some odd people who might go see it when they can share it?
Yeah, so we share the same classification system, but different provinces have slightly different rules as to like what constitutes coarse language or, various other film content related issues.
And for our final story, there's news about what might finally replace the Massey Tunnel. So one of the final things the previous government did was get a project rolling to build a 10-lane bridge to replace the perpetually congested tunnel between Delta and Richmond. And earlier this week, a Metro Vancouver task force of mayors and councillors endorsed one of the options, which is an 8-lane submerged tunnel to replace the current 4-lane one we have. Yeah,
so it's a recommendation. I believe they had a vote, and now there will be further committee review, and I think potentially another vote before the province gets involved, and then there will be a consultation on the option that is being selected. And so we're kind of making progress on this issue, but there's nothing coming anytime soon. I think we're still talking about several years to a decade before this solution actually comes to fruition.
Yeah, the NDP hasn't been in a particular rush to do it, much to the Liberals' annoyance, as well as people in Delta. Their local government's pretty anxious to get this going as well. But it does seem to be slowly moving ahead. And we'll just have to see where it goes from here.
Yep. I expect to potentially hear more questions about this in question period when we go back into the House next week.
Yeah, no doubt. But one group that wasn't happy about this, I guess, was the independent contractors and business associations who put out this weird YouTube video of doing a Backstreet Boys parody about the Massey Tunnel congestion.
Yep, I saw that this morning. It is a thing that you can watch on YouTube if you are so inclined. Yeah, they sure did make a video.
Just weird and kind of funny, and I'm not sure who's really the target demographic for Backstreet Boys parodies in 2019, but they apparently think they exist.
Well, I mean, they are trying to target people who are frustrated with the commute. So apparently they think there's an overlap between like Delta commuters and people who are big fans of the Backstreet Boys.
I guess so. Anyway, we'll throw the link in the show notes for anyone who wants to check that out and see the Horgan Smash graphics they've put on top of it.
Hulk Hogan in living color. Well, I guess animated color, but yeah, he's there.
Okay, well, before we sign off, Shannon, why don't you tell listeners where they can find you?
You can find me on Twitter. I live there all the time. My personal account is So Bitter, So Sweet. That's where you'll find most of the color. If you're looking for question period play-by-play and legislative announcements and some policy dissection and the latest in any stories that we put out front of the paywall, you can find me at BC Today Official.
And if they want to get behind the paywall, where can they find your work?
It is at BritishColumbiaToday.ca.
Okay, well, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And that has been Politicos. Find links to everything we talked about at politicos.ca. If you're a first-time listener, make sure to subscribe and let us know what you think. Support the show and get access to our exclusive Slack channel at patreon.com/politicos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Sergei Plotnikov. Thanks for listening.